Question 1. The performance metrics show a pattern of client dissatisfaction with a junior associate's advice on Alabama environmental compliance. The associate argues that their interpretations, while deviating from established agency guidance, are more aligned with the spirit of environmental protection and represent a better outcome for clients. The supervising attorney must determine how to address this discrepancy, considering the associate's adherence to Alabama's legal framework. Option A. Dismiss the client complaints, assuming the associate's novel interpretations, while unconventional, are likely to be accepted by courts given the evolving nature of environmental law. Option B. Advise the associate to focus on general principles of environmental ethics and sustainability, as these are more important than strict adherence to potentially outdated Alabama regulations. Option C. Accept the associate's interpretations if they are perceived as more beneficial to the client and less burdensome, regardless of their alignment with codified Alabama law. Option D. Review the associate's work product and client communications against the specific text of Alabama environmental statutes, administrative rules, and relevant Alabama case law to ensure interpretations are legally sound and authorized. The correct answer is D. Review the associate's work product and client communications against the specific text of Alabama environmental statutes, administrative rules, and relevant Alabama case law to ensure interpretations are legally sound and authorized. Explanation. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of client complaints regarding the interpretation and application of Alabama's environmental regulations by a new associate. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a supervisor to assess whether the associate's actions stem from a misunderstanding of the law or a deliberate disregard for its established meaning, touching upon the core tenets of legal positivism. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between genuine legal interpretation and potential ethical breaches. The best approach involves a thorough review of the associate's work product and client communications in light of the codified Alabama environmental statutes and administrative rules. This method aligns with legal positivism by focusing on the enacted laws as the sole source of legal authority. The supervisor should verify if the associate's interpretations are directly supported by the text of the regulations, relevant case law from Alabama courts, and official guidance from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. This ensures that legal advice is grounded in the positive law of the state, fulfilling the ethical duty to provide competent representation and adhere to the Alabama rules of professional conduct, particularly those concerning diligence and communication. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the complaints solely because the associate believes their interpretations are logical or fair, without reference to the actual Alabama statutes and regulations. It fails to acknowledge that under legal positivism, the validity of a law is separate from its moral content. Another incorrect approach is to rely on the associate's personal understanding of broader environmental principles without grounding it in specific Alabama law, effectively prioritizing personal philosophy over positive law. Finally, an approach that prioritizes expediency or avoiding client disputes over accurate legal application by simply agreeing with the associate's potentially flawed interpretations to placate clients also represents a failure to uphold professional standards and the integrity of legal advice within the framework of Alabama jurisprudence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the governing legal framework, Alabama statutes and regulations. Next, they must objectively assess the associate's work against this framework, seeking evidence of adherence or deviation. If deviations are found, the supervisor must determine if they are based on misinterpretation or a disregard for the law. This requires a commitment to the principle that legal obligations are derived from authoritative sources, not personal beliefs or external pressures. Question 2. The performance metrics show a significant divergence in client outcomes among financial advisors in an Alabama-based investment firm, considering the potential for both individual advisor conduct and broader firm-level influences. Which of the following investigative approaches best aligns with the principles of the Alabama Securities Act and professional ethical standards? Option A. Perform a cursory review of advisor-generated documentation without engaging with clients or considering the firm's operational environment, focusing only on easily identifiable compliance checkboxes. Option B. Accept the performance metrics at face value as indicators of individual advisor competence and take no further action, assuming the variations are solely due to personal skill levels. Option C. Immediately terminate the employment of all financial advisors whose performance metrics fall below a predetermined threshold, citing underperformance as the sole reason. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of individual advisor practices, client complaint histories, and adherence to firm policies and Alabama regulations, while also assessing whether firm-provided resources, training, and internal directives may be contributing to performance variations. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of individual advisor practices, client complaint histories, and adherence to firm policies and Alabama regulations, while also assessing whether firm-provided resources, training, and internal directives may be contributing to performance variations. Explanation: the performance metrics show a significant disparity in client outcomes across different financial advisors within the Alabama branch of a large investment firm. This scenario is professionally challenging because it raises concerns about potential systemic issues influencing advisor performance, rather than solely individual competence. The indeterminacy of the metrics themselves, coupled with the inherent power structures within a hierarchical firm, necessitates careful judgment to avoid misattributing outcomes and to ensure fair and ethical treatment of both clients and advisors. The best approach involves a multifaceted investigation that prioritizes client well-being and regulatory compliance. This includes a thorough review of individual advisor practices, client complaint logs, and adherence to Alabama Securities Act regulations. It also requires an objective assessment of whether the firm's internal policies, training programs, and resource allocation might be contributing to performance variations. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the potential for both individual misconduct and systemic failures, aligning with the fiduciary duty owed to clients and the regulatory obligation to supervise effectively. The Alabama Securities Act mandates that investment advisors act in the best interest of their clients and prohibits fraudulent or deceptive practices. A comprehensive review ensures that any deviations from these standards, whether by individuals or due to firm policies, are identified and rectified. An approach that focuses solely on terminating advisors with the lowest performance metrics without further investigation is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the indeterminacy of the metrics and the potential influence of power structures. It could lead to the termination of competent advisors who are facing undue pressure, lack adequate support, or are dealing with particularly challenging client circumstances that are not reflected in simple performance numbers. This overlooks the firm's supervisory responsibilities under Alabama law, which require a reasonable effort to ensure compliance by its representatives. Another unacceptable approach is to dismiss the performance disparities as mere individual variations and take no further action. This ignores the potential for systemic issues and the firm's obligation to ensure fair treatment and adequate supervision. It also fails to address potential client harm if the lower performance is due to inadequate advice or unethical practices that have gone unnoticed. This approach violates the spirit of regulatory oversight, which aims to protect investors and maintain market integrity. Finally, an approach that involves a superficial review of advisor files without considering external factors or client feedback is also professionally unsound. This might identify obvious compliance breaches, but would likely miss more subtle issues related to the quality of advice, suitability of recommendations, or the impact of firm-imposed pressures. It fails to provide a holistic understanding of the situation and could lead to incorrect conclusions about advisor performance and client outcomes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with data analysis, followed by hypothesis generation regarding potential causes, individual, systemic, or external. This should then lead to targeted investigations, including interviews, file reviews, and client outreach, always with a focus on fairness, transparency, and adherence to the Alabama Securities Act and ethical principles. The process should be iterative, allowing for adjustments based on new information, and should always prioritize the best interests of the client. Question 3. The performance metrics show a significant decline in client satisfaction scores related to the firm's understanding of historical legal precedents in Alabama. Considering the unique legal heritage of the state, which of the following strategies best addresses this issue? Option A. Assume that recent case law adequately reflects current legal understanding and disregard older precedents as largely irrelevant to modern practice in Alabama. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of landmark Alabama Supreme Court decisions and legislative history to understand the evolution of key legal principles within the state. Option C. Delegate the review of historical legal precedents to junior associates without direct oversight, trusting their general legal education to suffice for Alabama's specific context. Option D. Rely on generic legal research databases without specific focus on Alabama's historical legal development, assuming general legal principles apply universally. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of landmark Alabama Supreme Court decisions and legislative history to understand the evolution of key legal principles within the state. Explanation: the performance metrics show a significant decline in client satisfaction scores related to the firm's understanding of historical legal precedents in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts the firm's reputation and its ability to serve clients effectively within the specific legal landscape of Alabama. A deep understanding of Alabama's historical jurisprudence is not merely academic. It informs current legal strategy, client advisement, and the very interpretation of statutes and case law. Failure to grasp this historical context can lead to misinformed advice, lost cases, and ethical breaches related to competence. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive review of Alabama's legal history, focusing on landmark decisions and the evolution of key legal principles within the state. This includes examining the foundational cases that shaped Alabama law, understanding the historical context of legislative changes, and recognizing how societal shifts have influenced judicial interpretation in Alabama. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the identified performance gap by fostering the necessary expertise. It aligns with the ethical duty of competence, requiring legal professionals to possess the knowledge and skill ordinarily required or expected of lawyers in good standing in Alabama. Furthermore, it demonstrates a commitment to providing clients with advice grounded in a thorough understanding of the state's unique legal heritage, which is crucial for effective representation in Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the performance metrics as a temporary anomaly or to rely solely on generic legal databases without specific attention to Alabama's historical development. This is professionally unacceptable because it ignores a clear indication of a knowledge deficit. It fails to meet the ethical obligation to be knowledgeable about the law, particularly the specific body of law governing Alabama. Relying on generic information without historical context can lead to the application of outdated or irrelevant precedents, misinterpreting the intent behind current statutes, and ultimately providing substandard advice to clients in Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the review of historical precedents to junior staff without adequate supervision or guidance. While delegation can be a useful tool, the ultimate responsibility for competence rests with the supervising attorney. This approach is professionally unacceptable as it risks compounding the knowledge gap if the junior staff lack the necessary expertise or understanding of how to critically analyze historical legal materials specific to Alabama. It also fails to ensure that the firm's understanding of Alabama jurisprudence is accurate and up-to-date, potentially leading to ethical violations related to supervision and competence. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on recent case law, assuming that older precedents are no longer relevant. This is professionally unacceptable because many fundamental legal principles in Alabama have deep historical roots, and understanding their evolution is critical to interpreting their current application. Ignoring historical context can lead to a superficial understanding of the law, failing to grasp the underlying reasoning of current decisions, and potentially misapplying established legal doctrines within Alabama. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with acknowledging and analyzing performance data, identifying specific knowledge gaps, and then developing targeted strategies to address them. This involves a commitment to continuous learning, a willingness to invest in understanding the specific legal environment of Alabama, and a proactive approach to ensuring competence for the benefit of clients. Question 4. The performance metrics show a concerning trend of client dissatisfaction with financial advice provided in Alabama. A financial advisor, deeply influenced by the natural law philosophy of John Finney's, believes that the ultimate good for an individual is to flourish, which in his interpretation includes maximizing personal wealth through aggressive investment strategies. He is considering recommending a high-risk, illiquid investment to a client that, while potentially offering substantial returns, carries a significant risk of capital loss and is not fully understood by the client. The advisor rationalizes this recommendation by arguing that the client's flourishing is best served by the pursuit of wealth, and that the client has the freedom to accept or reject the risk, aligning with a natural law emphasis on autonomy. How should this advisor proceed, considering Alabama's regulatory framework for financial professionals? Option A. The advisor should recommend the investment, but only after a brief verbal explanation of the risks, assuming that the client's desire for wealth inherently means they are comfortable with significant risk, thus fulfilling a broad interpretation of natural law's emphasis on individual pursuit of good. Option B. The advisor should proceed with the recommendation, emphasizing the client's autonomy and the potential for wealth maximization as the ultimate good, as interpreted through Finney's natural law philosophy, believing that the client's free choice absolves the advisor of further responsibility. Option C. The advisor must prioritize the client's understanding and the suitability of the investment within the context of Alabama's disclosure and suitability regulations, ensuring the client comprehends the risks and that the investment aligns with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, even if it means foregoing a potentially lucrative but unsuitable recommendation. Option D. The advisor should recommend the investment, focusing solely on the potential for high returns and the client's stated desire for wealth, believing that the pursuit of financial gain is a primary natural law good and that regulatory compliance is secondary to facilitating this natural law imperative. The correct answer is C. The advisor must prioritize the client's understanding and the suitability of the investment within the context of Alabama's disclosure and suitability regulations, ensuring the client comprehends the risks and that the investment aligns with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, even if it means foregoing a potentially lucrative but unsuitable recommendation. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in client complaints regarding the ethical conduct of financial advisors in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires advisors to navigate complex ethical dilemmas that intersect with their understanding of natural law principles as interpreted by key proponents like Aquinas and Finney's, and how these principles are reflected in Alabama's specific regulatory framework for financial professionals. A careful judgment is required to ensure client trust and adherence to legal and ethical standards. The best approach involves a comprehensive understanding of both natural law theory and its practical application within the Alabama regulatory environment. This means recognizing that, while natural law provides a foundational ethical framework, financial professionals must operate strictly within the bounds of codified Alabama law and regulations governing their practice. This approach prioritizes adherence to established legal duties, fiduciary responsibilities, and disclosure requirements as mandated by Alabama statutes and regulatory bodies, ensuring that client interests are protected through legally enforceable mechanisms. It acknowledges that, while natural law might inform an advisor's personal ethical compass, professional conduct must be demonstrably aligned with the specific legal obligations imposed by the state. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a personal interpretation of natural law, without considering the specific legal requirements of Alabama. This could lead to actions that, while perhaps perceived as ethically sound from a purely philosophical standpoint, violate Alabama's statutes or regulations, potentially harming clients and resulting in disciplinary action. For instance, an advisor might believe that withholding certain information is ethically permissible under a natural law interpretation of avoiding harm, but this would likely contravene Alabama's disclosure laws, which mandate transparency. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize profit or firm objectives over client well-being, even if such prioritization is rationalized through a selective interpretation of natural law principles that emphasizes individual liberty or economic efficiency. This fails to acknowledge the inherent ethical duty of care and loyalty that Alabama law imposes on financial professionals, particularly when acting in a fiduciary capacity. Such an approach disregards the regulatory framework designed to protect vulnerable investors from exploitation. Finally, an approach that focuses on superficial compliance with regulations without a genuine understanding of the underlying ethical principles, including those informed by natural law, is also flawed. While adherence to rules is necessary, a deeper ethical grounding, informed by concepts of justice and the common good as articulated by thinkers like Aquinas and Finney's, is crucial for building trust and providing truly client-centric advice. Alabama's regulatory framework, while specific, is built upon a foundation of ethical principles that, when ignored, can lead to a breakdown in professional integrity. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of their fiduciary duties and all applicable Alabama laws and regulations. This legal foundation should then be informed by a robust ethical compass, drawing on principles of natural law as a guide for discerning right from wrong, but always subordinate to legal mandates. When faced with an ethical dilemma, professionals should ask, does this action comply with all Alabama statutes and regulations? Does it uphold my fiduciary duty to the client? Does it align with fundamental ethical principles of fairness and honesty? If any of these questions cannot be answered affirmatively, the action should be reconsidered. Question 5. The efficiency study reveals that a recent amendment to Alabama's landlord-tenant statutes, when interpreted literally, could allow a landlord to evict a tenant for a minor, unintentional infraction that occurred during a period of documented emergency, potentially leading to significant hardship for the tenant. Considering the jurisprudential underpinnings of Alabama law, which approach best balances the legislative intent of the statute with the broader principles of justice and fairness. Option A. Strictly apply the literal wording of the amended statute, as it is the most direct expression of legislative will, regardless of the potential hardship or the context of the emergency. Option B. Interpret the statute in light of established Alabama case law and equitable principles, considering the legislative intent and the specific circumstances of the emergency, to determine if a strict application would lead to an unconscionable outcome. Option C. Advocate for a complete disregard of the amended statute in favor of a more generalized, abstract notion of fairness that prioritizes the tenant's immediate well-being over the codified law. Option D. Prioritize the perceived efficiency of a swift eviction process by applying the statute literally, assuming the legislature intended to streamline such actions without regard for individual circumstances. The correct answer is B. Interpret the statute in light of established Alabama case law and equitable principles, considering the legislative intent and the specific circumstances of the emergency, to determine if a strict application would lead to an unconscionable outcome. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential conflict between the strict adherence to codified law and the broader principles of justice and fairness in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because legal professionals in Alabama are bound by the Alabama Code and relevant case law, but they also operate within an ethical framework that demands consideration of equitable outcomes and the spirit of the law. Balancing these can be difficult, especially when a literal interpretation of a statute might lead to an outcome that feels unjust. The best approach involves recognizing that while statutes provide the primary framework for legal decision-making in Alabama, the underlying legal philosophy often acknowledges the need for interpretation and the application of equitable principles to achieve justice. This approach prioritizes understanding the legislative intent behind the statute, considering relevant Alabama case law that may have refined or interpreted the statute, and evaluating whether a strict application would lead to an unconscionable result. This aligns with the broader jurisprudential understanding that law is not merely a set of rigid rules, but a dynamic system designed to serve justice. Alabama courts, like many others, have mechanisms for equitable relief and interpretative canons that allow for flexibility when strict adherence would undermine fundamental fairness. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a literal, uninterpreted reading of the Alabama Code, ignoring any potential for equitable considerations or the evolution of legal interpretation through case law. This fails to acknowledge that statutes are often interpreted by courts to address unforeseen circumstances or to prevent absurd results, which is a core tenet of legal philosophy. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the Alabama Code entirely in favor of abstract notions of fairness or personal moral beliefs. This is professionally unacceptable, as it abandons the foundational legal framework that governs practice in Alabama and could lead to arbitrary and unpredictable outcomes, violating the rule of law. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize the perceived efficiency of a quick resolution over the substantive legal and ethical considerations, potentially leading to a rushed judgment that overlooks critical legal nuances or equitable defenses. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly researching the relevant Alabama statutes and controlling Alabama case law. They should then consider the underlying legal philosophy that informs these laws, particularly how Alabama courts have balanced strict legal rules with equitable principles. This involves asking, what was the likely intent of the legislature? How have courts interpreted similar provisions? Would a strict application of the law in this specific instant lead to a result that is fundamentally unfair or contrary to the public good as understood within Alabama jurisprudence? This analytical process ensures that decisions are grounded in law while also striving for just outcomes. Question 6. Implementation of a financial advisory strategy in Alabama that prioritizes a client's perceived inherent right to absolute financial autonomy, potentially overlooking specific Alabama Securities Act disclosure mandates, represents a critique of which legal philosophy? Option A. A critique that emphasizes adherence to Alabama's codified statutes and established common law precedents as the ultimate arbiter of professional conduct. Option B. A critique that advocates for the primacy of individual liberty and freedom from governmental regulation in all economic matters. Option C. A critique that focuses on the practical consequences and societal impact of financial decisions, irrespective of abstract legal principles. Option D. A critique that champions a universal, inherent moral order dictating rights and obligations, independent of specific jurisdictional laws. The correct answer is A. A critique that emphasizes adherence to Alabama's codified statutes and established common law precedents as the ultimate arbiter of professional conduct. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a financial advisor in Alabama to reconcile the theoretical underpinnings of natural law with the practical realities of Alabama's specific statutory and common law framework governing financial advice. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts between abstract moral principles and concrete legal obligations, ensuring that their advice is both ethically sound and legally compliant within the state. The best approach involves a rigorous examination of Alabama's codified laws and judicial precedents that define fiduciary duties, disclosure requirements, and suitability standards for financial advisors. This approach is correct because it grounds the advisor's actions in the legally binding framework of Alabama, the Alabama Securities Act, and relevant Alabama rules of professional conduct for attorneys, which often inform ethical standards for financial professionals, mandate specific duties of care, loyalty, and disclosure. Adhering to these established legal and ethical guidelines ensures that the advisor acts in the client's best interest as defined by the jurisdiction, avoiding potential legal repercussions and upholding professional integrity. This aligns with the principle that while natural law may inform ethical considerations, legal compliance within the specific jurisdiction is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a generalized, abstract interpretation of natural law principles, such as an unqualified assertion of inherent property rights that might override specific Alabama disclosure requirements. This is professionally unacceptable because it disregards the detailed regulatory landscape established by the Alabama legislature and interpreted by Alabama courts. Such an approach could lead to advice that, while perhaps perceived as morally just by the advisor, violates Alabama's securities laws or fiduciary standards, exposing both the advisor and the client to significant risk. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the client's immediate perceived desires over established legal and ethical obligations, even if those desires seem to align with a broad interpretation of natural justice. This is professionally unacceptable, as it fails to acknowledge the advisor's legal and ethical duty to act in the client's best interest, according to the standards set forth in Alabama law, which may include limitations on certain investments or require specific disclosures that the client might wish to bypass. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the relevance of Alabama's legal framework entirely, arguing that natural law provides a higher, universally applicable standard that supersedes state-specific regulations. This is professionally unacceptable because it ignores the fundamental principle that legal and ethical obligations for financial professionals are concretely defined by the jurisdiction in which they operate. While natural law can offer a philosophical backdrop, it does not grant a license to disregard binding state laws and regulations. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a hierarchical assessment. First, identify and understand the specific laws and regulations of Alabama governing financial advice. Second, consider how established ethical codes and professional standards, often informed by natural law concepts, apply within that legal framework. Third, critically evaluate any potential conflicts, prioritizing adherence to the legally mandated requirements of Alabama. Finally, document the decision-making process, demonstrating a clear understanding of and compliance with the relevant legal and ethical obligations. Question 7. To address the challenge of understanding the foundational principles of legal obligation and authority within the Alabama legal system, which of the following theoretical approaches best explains how legal rules are identified as valid and binding, and how individuals are obligated to follow them? Option A. Adhering strictly to John Austin's command theory, which posits that law is a command from a sovereign backed by the threat of sanctions, and that legal obligation arises solely from the fear of punishment by this sovereign entity. Option B. Emphasizing the historical evolution of legal positivism, tracing the development from early positivist ideas to contemporary theories, without specifically applying any single theorist's framework to the practical identification of legal validity and obligation in Alabama. Option C. Prioritizing Hart's concept of the rule of recognition, which identifies the criteria for legal validity and distinguishes between primary and secondary rules, thereby providing a practical framework for understanding the dynamic nature of Alabama law and the sources of legal obligation. Option D. Focusing exclusively on Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law, which views law as a hierarchical system of norms derived from a presupposed basic norm, and where legal validity is determined by the conformity of lower norms to higher ones within this abstract structure. The correct answer is C. Prioritizing Hart's concept of the rule of recognition, which identifies the criteria for legal validity and distinguishes between primary and secondary rules, thereby providing a practical framework for understanding the dynamic nature of Alabama law and the sources of legal obligation. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the foundational philosophical underpinnings of law and their practical implications within the Alabama legal system, specifically concerning the nature of legal obligation and the source of legal authority. This necessitates a deep understanding of how different legal theorists conceptualize law, which directly impacts how one interprets and applies Alabama statutes and case law. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between purely descriptive accounts of law and prescriptive theories that dictate how law ought to be understood and followed. The best professional approach involves recognizing that, while all three theorists offer valuable insights into the nature of law, Hart's concept of the rule of recognition provides the most practical and comprehensive framework for understanding legal validity and obligation within a developed legal system like Alabama's. Hart acknowledges the existence of both primary rules, conduct governing rules, and secondary rules, rules about rules, including the rule of recognition, which identifies valid laws. This framework allows for a dynamic legal system where laws can be created, changed, and adjudicated, reflecting the reality of Alabama's legislative and judicial processes. Understanding the rule of recognition helps in identifying which pronouncements are legally binding in Alabama, thereby fulfilling legal obligations. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on John Austin's command theory. While Austin's emphasis on a sovereign issuing commands backed by sanctions is historically significant, it fails to adequately explain the complexity of modern legal systems. In Alabama, legal obligation arises not just from the direct command of a singular sovereign, but from a complex interplay of statutes enacted by the legislature, precedents set by the courts, and constitutional provisions. Austin's theory struggles to account for the persistence of law beyond the life of a particular sovereign, or the existence of laws that do not directly stem from a sovereign's explicit command, such as customary law or international law incorporated into domestic law. This approach would lead to an incomplete understanding of legal authority in Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively adopt Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law. Kelsen's focus on a hierarchical structure of norms culminating in a hypothetical basic norm, Grundnorm, is an abstract conceptualization of law. While it offers a rigorous logical framework, it can be detached from the practical realities of legal practice in Alabama. The basic norm is a presupposition, not an empirically verifiable rule. Professionals in Alabama need to engage with concrete legal sources, statutes, judicial decisions, and constitutional provisions, rather than relying solely on an abstract, presupposed norm to determine legal validity and obligation. This approach risks oversimplifying the practical application of law and the sources of legal authority within the state. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a tiered approach. First, identify the specific legal question or obligation within the Alabama context. Second, consider the various philosophical lenses through which law can be viewed, acknowledging the contributions of theorists like Hart, Kelson, and Austin. Third, critically evaluate which theoretical framework best explains the practical operation of the Alabama legal system and the sources of its authority. In this case, Hart's framework, with its emphasis on the rule of recognition and the interplay of primary and secondary rules, offers the most robust and practically applicable understanding for navigating Alabama jurisprudence. Question 8. The review process indicates a scenario where an attorney licensed in Alabama is asked by a client to pursue a legal strategy that, while not explicitly illegal under Alabama statutes, deeply conflicts with the attorney's personal moral code. The attorney believes the client's underlying actions, though not criminal, are ethically reprehensible. Considering the distinction between law and morality within the context of Alabama jurisprudence, which of the following approaches best reflects the attorney's professional obligations? Option A. Diligently research and apply all relevant Alabama statutes and case law to construct the most effective legal strategy for the client, ensuring the strategy operates strictly within the bounds of the law, irrespective of personal moral objections. Option B. Advise the client on how to subtly circumvent the spirit of the law, even if the proposed actions are not directly prohibited by Alabama statutes, to achieve their morally objectionable goals. Option C. Refuse to represent the client entirely, citing a conflict between the client's objectives and the attorney's personal moral beliefs, without further investigation into the legality of the proposed strategy. Option D. Subtly manipulate the legal process or present weaker arguments than are available, based on the attorney's personal disapproval of the client's actions, to indirectly discourage the client. Correct answer is A. Diligently research and apply all relevant Alabama statutes and case law to construct the most effective legal strategy for the client, ensuring the strategy operates strictly within the bounds of the law, irrespective of personal moral objections. Explanation. The review process indicates a common challenge in legal practice, navigating the intersection of established legal precedent and personal ethical convictions. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a legal professional in Alabama to reconcile a client's request, which may be morally objectionable to the professional, with their legal obligations and the principles of justice. The professional must exercise careful judgment to uphold their duty to the client, while adhering to the ethical standards and legal framework governing attorneys in Alabama. The best professional approach involves diligently researching and applying Alabama law to the client's situation, regardless of personal moral feelings. This means thoroughly understanding relevant statutes, case law, and procedural rules within Alabama to construct the strongest possible legal defense or strategy for the client. This approach is correct because the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct, specifically Rule 1, 2, Scope of representation, obligate attorneys to represent clients diligently within the bounds of the law. While attorneys have personal morals, their professional duty is to the legal system and their clients' lawful interests. The Alabama State Bar's ethical opinions and the Alabama Code of Ethics reinforce the principle that an attorney's personal beliefs should not impede their ability to provide competent and zealous representation within legal boundaries. An incorrect approach would be to refuse representation solely based on a personal moral objection to the client's alleged actions, without first assessing the legality of those actions or the potential for a lawful defense. This fails to uphold the attorney's duty to the client and could be seen as an abandonment of professional responsibility, potentially violating Rule 1. 16. Declining or terminating representation, if not handled appropriately. Another incorrect approach is to advise the client to engage in illegal or unethical conduct to circumvent the law, which directly contravenes the attorney's obligation to uphold the law and could lead to disciplinary action. Finally, attempting to subtly undermine the client's case due to personal disapproval, rather than presenting the best legal arguments, is a breach of the duty of loyalty and competence owed to the client. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the client's objectives within the context of Alabama law. This involves a thorough factual investigation, comprehensive legal research, and an objective assessment of the legal merits of the client's position. If the client's objectives are unlawful, the attorney must counsel the client against pursuing them and may need to consider withdrawing from representation in accordance with ethical rules. However, if the objectives are lawful, the attorney's moral compass should not dictate the quality or nature of the legal representation provided. Question 9. Examination of the data shows that in Alabama, an investment advisory firm has engaged two distinct advisors to provide recommendations for a single client's portfolio. Advisor has provided a detailed analysis of the client's risk tolerance and suggested a diversified portfolio heavily weighted towards growth stocks. Advisor B, while acknowledging Advisor A's analysis, has recommended a more conservative approach, emphasizing fixed-income securities, citing recent market volatility. Both advisors have communicated their recommendations directly to the client, which approach best reflects the necessary deconstruction and understanding of the advice provided in this scenario. Option A. Thoroughly deconstruct each advisor's specific recommendations and rationale, then assess their combined suitability for the client, ensuring clarity on the origin and basis of each component of the final investment strategy. Option B. Focus on the advisor who appears to have the most significant influence or has provided the most extensive analysis, potentially downplaying the contributions of the other advisor. Option C. Assume that the plurality of advice, if one advisor's recommendation is more frequently echoed by other market participants, represents the most appropriate course of action for the client. Option D. Treat the advice from both advisors as a single, undifferentiated recommendation, assuming that the client will synthesize the information appropriately without further clarification. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly deconstruct each advisor's specific recommendations and rationale, then assess their combined suitability for the client, ensuring clarity on the origin and basis of each component of the final investment strategy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent ambiguity in interpreting Alabama's regulatory framework concerning the deconstruction of investment advice when multiple advisors are involved. The core difficulty lies in determining the extent to which each advisor's contribution constitutes a distinct, actionable piece of advice versus a shared or collaborative input. Alabama law, like many jurisdictions, emphasizes clarity and suitability in investment recommendations. When multiple parties contribute, the risk of misattribution, conflicting advice, or a lack of clear responsibility increases, potentially leading to client confusion and regulatory scrutiny. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the client receives advice that is both suitable and clearly attributable to a responsible party, adhering to Alabama's fiduciary duties and disclosure requirements. The best professional approach involves a thorough deconstruction of the advice provided by each advisor, identifying specific recommendations and the rationale behind them, and then assessing whether these contributions, when viewed collectively, form a cohesive and suitable investment strategy for the client. This approach prioritizes understanding the substance of the advice and its impact on the client's portfolio. It aligns with Alabama's regulatory emphasis on suitability and clear communication, ensuring that the client can understand who provided what advice and why it is appropriate for their circumstances. This methodical deconstruction allows for the identification of any potential conflicts or gaps in advice, facilitating a clear and defensible position for all parties involved, and most importantly, for the client's benefit. An incorrect approach would be to simply aggregate all advice without critical analysis, assuming that a plurality of inputs automatically leads to a superior or legally compliant outcome. This fails to address the potential for conflicting recommendations or advice that, while individually sound, becomes unsuitable when combined. It also neglects the regulatory requirement to understand the specific basis for each recommendation and its suitability for the client. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss contributions from certain advisors based on their perceived level of influence or the perceived plurality of advice from another. This overlooks the possibility that even seemingly minor contributions could be critical to the overall investment decision, or that the regulatory framework may attribute responsibility based on the act of providing advice, regardless of its perceived weight. Alabama regulations require a comprehensive understanding of all advice provided, not just the most prominent. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the number of advisors offering similar advice, assuming that the most frequently repeated recommendation is inherently the correct or legally sound one. This plurality approach ignores the qualitative aspects of the advice, the specific circumstances of the client, and the underlying regulatory principles of suitability and fiduciary duty. The law does not endorse a democratic vote on investment advice. It demands a reasoned and suitable recommendation. Professional reasoning in such situations should involve a systematic process of 1. Identifying all parties involved in providing advice. 2. Meticulously deconstructing each piece of advice, noting its specific nature, rationale, and source. 3. Assessing the cumulative effect of all advice on the client's investment strategy. 4. Evaluating the suitability of the combined advice against the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, in accordance with Alabama's regulatory standards. And 5. Ensuring clear documentation and communication to the client regarding the origin and rationale of all advice received. Question 10. Upon reviewing a client's financial situation and stated risk tolerance in Alabama, an investment advisor is considering two portfolio allocation models. Model A, based on historical data, projects an average annual return of 8% with a standard deviation of 12%. Model B, also based on historical data, projects an average annual return of 7% with a standard deviation of 9%. If the current risk-free rate is 2%, which portfolio allocation model demonstrates a superior risk-adjusted return based on empirical analysis? Option A, Model B, as its lower standard deviation of 9% signifies a less volatile investment which is inherently superior regardless of return. Option B, Model A, as its Sharpe ratio is approximately 0.50, indicating a better return per unit of risk compared to Model B's Sharpe ratio of approximately 0.56. Option C, Model B, as its Sharpe ratio is approximately 0.56, indicating a better return per unit of risk compared to Model A's Sharpe ratio of approximately 0.50. Option D, Model A, because its higher projected average annual return of 8% is more attractive to clients, even with higher volatility. The correct answer is B, Model A, as its Sharpe ratio is approximately 0.50, indicating a better return per unit of risk compared to Model B's Sharpe ratio of approximately 0.56. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an investment advisor to balance the client's stated risk tolerance with the empirical data derived from market analysis, while adhering to Alabama's specific regulatory framework for investment advice. The advisor must not only understand the client's subjective feelings about risk, but also objectively assess the potential outcomes of different investment strategies based on historical performance and statistical probabilities, all within the bounds of fiduciary duty and suitability requirements. The best approach involves a quantitative assessment of potential portfolio performance under various market conditions, using historical data to model expected returns and volatility. This aligns with the empirical approach to law, which emphasizes observable data and statistical analysis. Specifically, under Alabama law and general investment advisory principles, advisors have a duty to provide advice that is suitable for the client. This suitability is best determined by a rigorous, data-driven analysis that quantifies risk and return. For instance, calculating the Sharpe ratio for different portfolio allocations allows for a standardized comparison of risk-adjusted returns. The Sharpe ratio is calculated as \\text Sharpe ratio equals \frac key RP RF sigma P where \E RP is the expected return of the portfolio. \RF is the risk-free rate of return. \sigma P is the standard deviation of the portfolio's returns, a measure of volatility or risk. By comparing Sharpe ratios across various portfolio allocations, the advisor can objectively identify which strategy offers the most efficient return for the level of risk undertaken. thereby fulfilling the duty of care and suitability mandated by Alabama regulations. This empirical method provides a concrete, defensible basis for recommendations. An approach that relies solely on the client's verbalized risk tolerance without empirical validation is professionally unacceptable. While client input is crucial, it can be subjective and influenced by recent market events or emotional biases. Failing to cross-reference this with objective data means the advisor might be recommending a portfolio that, while sounding good to the client, carries statistically higher risks or lower potential returns than other suitable alternatives. This could violate the duty to act in the client's best interest, as it prioritizes subjective perception over objective analysis. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to present only hypothetical best-case scenarios without acknowledging the statistical probability of adverse outcomes. This misrepresents the true risk profile of an investment and can lead to client dissatisfaction and potential regulatory scrutiny. Alabama's regulations, like those in most jurisdictions, require full and fair disclosure of all material risks. Ignoring the empirical likelihood of negative returns or significant volatility is a failure of this disclosure obligation. Finally, an approach that focuses exclusively on past performance without considering future market dynamics or the statistical distribution of returns is also flawed. While historical data is a key input for empirical analysis, simply extrapolating past returns into the future without considering volatility and the potential for deviation from the mean is an oversimplification. This can lead to recommendations that are not robust across different market cycles and may not be truly suitable in the long term. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates client objectives and risk tolerance with robust empirical analysis. This involves 1. Understanding the client's stated goals and risk preferences. 2. Gathering relevant historical market data. 3. Applying quantitative methods like calculating Sharpe ratios, value at risk, VAR, or conducting Monte Carlo simulations to model potential outcomes and risk-adjusted returns for various investment strategies. 4. Presenting these findings to the client in a clear, understandable manner, explaining both the potential benefits and the statistically derived risks. 5. Collaboratively selecting a portfolio that aligns with both the client's preferences and the empirically supported optimal risk-return profile. Question 11. When evaluating the development and application of legal principles within Alabama, which of the following perspectives most accurately reflects the dynamic interplay between formal legal rules and the practical realities that shape judicial outcomes, drawing upon the insights of key legal thinkers? Option A. Law is primarily a system of abstract, logical rules derived from statutes and precedent, where judicial decisions should strictly adhere to deductive reasoning to ensure consistency and predictability, irrespective of external societal factors. Option B. Law is an expression of the sovereign's will, and judicial decisions are merely the enforcement of preordained commands, with little room for interpretation or adaptation based on evolving societal norms or practical considerations. Option C. Law is a tool for achieving social justice, and judges should prioritize achieving equitable outcomes based on their personal sense of fairness, even if it means disregarding established legal rules and precedents. Option D. Law is a product of societal experience and practical needs, with judicial decisions reflecting a pragmatic adaptation of rules to address real-world problems, acknowledging the influence of social and economic context on legal interpretation. The correct answer is D. Law is a product of societal experience and practical needs, with judicial decisions reflecting a pragmatic adaptation of rules to address real-world problems, acknowledging the influence of social and economic context on legal interpretation. Explanation. When evaluating the application of legal philosophy to Alabama jurisprudence, particularly concerning the development of legal principles, professional faces the challenge of discerning which theoretical lens best explains the evolution of Alabama law and its practical application. This requires understanding the nuances of judicial reasoning and the underlying philosophies that inform it. The approach that best reflects a nuanced understanding of Alabama jurisprudence, acknowledging the dynamic nature of law and the influence of societal context, involves recognizing that legal rules are not static pronouncements, but rather are shaped by the practical needs and evolving values of the community. This perspective aligns with the realist tradition, which emphasizes that law in action, as determined by judges and administrators, is often more significant than law in books. It acknowledges that judges, while bound by precedent, also bring their own experiences and societal understandings to bear on their decisions, leading to a pragmatic and context-sensitive application of legal principles. This aligns with the spirit of figures like Holmes, who famously stated that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. An approach that solely focuses on the logical deduction of rules from established statutes and prior judicial decisions, without considering the practical impact or societal context, fails to capture the full picture of Alabama jurisprudence. This rigid adherence to formalistic reasoning overlooks the realist critique that such an approach can lead to outcomes that are divorced from the realities of life and may not serve the best interests of justice in Alabama. It ignores the influence of social and economic factors that Holmes and Llewellyn argued are crucial to understanding how law actually operates. Another approach that is professionally unacceptable is one that dismisses the importance of precedent and established legal principles entirely in favor of purely subjective judicial discretion. While acknowledging that judges are influenced by their backgrounds, this extreme view undermines the principle of legal certainty and predictability, which are foundational to a stable legal system in Alabama. It fails to recognize the value of stare decisis and the need for consistency in judicial decision-making, which are essential for public trust and the rule of law. A professional decision-making process in this context should involve a comparative analysis of legal theories and their applicability to the specific legal issues at hand within Alabama. It requires understanding that, while formal legal rules provide a framework, the practical application and evolution of these rules are deeply influenced by social, economic, and historical factors. Professionals should consider how different philosophical approaches, such as legal realism, can illuminate the actual functioning of the Alabama legal system and inform their understanding of judicial decision-making. This involves moving beyond a purely textual or formalistic interpretation to embrace a more contextual and pragmatic understanding of the law. Question 12. The analysis reveals that a legal scholar is examining Alabama's historical land ownership statutes and their impact on contemporary rural communities. Considering the principles of critical legal studies, which of the following approaches would best inform a nuanced understanding of how these laws might reflect and perpetuate power imbalances within Alabama? Option A. Critically analyze Alabama's property law doctrines, investigating how historical power structures and social inequalities may have influenced their development and current application, and how they affect access to and control over land in rural Alabama. Option B. Dismiss critical legal studies as an overly theoretical academic pursuit with no practical relevance to the application of Alabama's property laws. Option C. Apply generalized theories of power and inequality to Alabama's land ownership laws without specific consideration of the state's unique legal history, socioeconomic context, or relevant case law. Option D. Advocate for the immediate abolition of all historical land ownership statutes in Alabama, arguing that their origins inherently render them unjust and incapable of serving contemporary needs. The correct answer is A. Critically analyze Alabama's property law doctrines, investigating how historical power structures and social inequalities may have influenced their development and current application, and how they affect access to and control over land in rural Alabama. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the inherent tensions between established legal doctrines and the critical examination of power structures that critical legal studies, CLS, highlights. The challenge lies in applying CLS principles, which often question the neutrality and fairness of existing legal frameworks, to a practical legal context in Alabama, without undermining the foundational principles of the state's jurisprudence. Careful judgment is required to ensure that a CLS-informed analysis leads to constructive engagement with the law rather than outright rejection, maintaining professional integrity and adherence to Alabama's legal system. The best approach involves critically examining Alabama's property law principles through a CLS lens, focusing on how historical power dynamics and social inequalities may have shaped current legal interpretations and outcomes, particularly concerning land ownership and access. This approach is correct because it directly engages with the core tenets of CLS by questioning the neutrality of legal rules and exploring their relationship to power, while remaining grounded within the specific context of Alabama's legal framework. It seeks to understand how existing laws might perpetuate or challenge existing social hierarchies, offering a nuanced critique that can inform legal practice and advocacy within the state's jurisdiction. This aligns with the professional responsibility to understand the law's social impact and to advocate for justice within the existing legal system, even when critiquing its foundations. An incorrect approach would be to advocate for the wholesale dismantling of Alabama's property laws based solely on a CLS critique of their historical origins, without proposing alternative legal frameworks or considering the practical implications for property rights and stability within the state. It fails to acknowledge the role of law in providing order and predictability, and it overlooks the potential for reform within existing structures. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss CLS entirely as an academic exercise, irrelevant to the practical application of Alabama law, thereby ignoring the potential insights it offers into systemic biases and power imbalances that may affect legal outcomes. This approach is professionally deficient, as it forecloses a deeper understanding of the law's social context and its impact on different groups within Alabama. Finally, applying CLS principles without specific reference to Alabama's statutory and case law, or to the unique socio-economic conditions of the state, would render the analysis abstract and unhelpful for practical legal work within the jurisdiction. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a commitment to understanding the law in its broadest sense, including its historical development, social implications, and potential for bias. It involves a willingness to critically engage with legal doctrines, to identify areas where power imbalances may be embedded, and to advocate for equitable outcomes. Professionals should first seek to understand the specific legal rules and precedents within Alabama. Then, they should consider how CLS perspectives might illuminate potential issues of fairness, access, or power related to those rules. The goal should be to use these insights to inform legal strategy, client advice, or policy recommendations that promote justice and equity within the framework of Alabama jurisprudence. Question 13. Comparative studies suggest that the evolution of financial regulation in Alabama has been significantly influenced by specific historical milestones and judicial interpretations. Which of the following best reflects a deep understanding of the origins and development of Alabama's regulatory framework for financial professionals? Option A. Extrapolating the development of financial regulation in Alabama, based primarily on the historical trajectories of financial regulation in other prominent U.S. states. Option B. Analyzing the progression of Alabama statutes and case law that progressively defined and strengthened concepts such as suitability, fiduciary responsibility, and disclosure requirements for financial advisors. Option C. Assuming that the development of financial regulation in Alabama has been a consistent and uninterrupted process, with no significant periods of legislative debate or judicial reinterpretation. Option D. Focusing exclusively on the current Alabama Securities Act and its immediate implementing regulations, without considering prior legislative or judicial actions. The correct answer is B. Analyzing the progression of Alabama statutes and case law that progressively defined and strengthened concepts such as suitability, fiduciary responsibility, and disclosure requirements for financial advisors. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how historical legal and societal shifts in Alabama have shaped its current regulatory landscape for financial professionals. Navigating this requires more than rote memorization of current statutes. It demands an appreciation for the evolution of consumer protection, fiduciary duties, and the very definition of financial advice within the state. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between superficial similarities and genuine developmental trajectories. The best approach involves a nuanced examination of Alabama's legal history, specifically tracing the development of statutes and case law that have progressively defined and regulated the practice of financial advising. This includes understanding how concepts like suitability, fiduciary responsibility, and disclosure requirements have been introduced and strengthened over time, often in response to specific economic events or perceived abuses. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the question of origins and development by analyzing the historical progression of legal frameworks and judicial interpretations that have molded Alabama's regulatory environment. It aligns with the principle of understanding the foundational principles upon which current regulations are built, providing a robust basis for professional practice. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the current Alabama Securities Act without considering its historical antecedents. This fails to address the origins and development aspect of the question, treating the current law as if it sprang into existence without prior influence. This approach is ethically and regulatorily deficient, as it lacks the depth of understanding necessary to interpret the spirit and intent behind current provisions, potentially leading to misapplication or overlooking nuances. Another incorrect approach would be to draw parallels with the development of financial regulation in other states, such as New York or California, without a specific focus on Alabama's unique legislative and judicial history. While other states' experiences might offer insights, Alabama's regulatory development is a distinct path influenced by its own economic, social, and political context. Relying on external comparisons without grounding in Alabama's specific history risks misinterpreting the forces that shaped its laws. This is a regulatory failure because it does not adhere to the jurisdictional specificity required for Alabama jurisprudence. A final incorrect approach would be to assume that the development of financial regulation in Alabama has been a linear and uninterrupted process. Historical legal development is often characterized by periods of significant change, retrenchment, and adaptation. Failing to acknowledge these complexities can lead to an oversimplified understanding that does not reflect the dynamic nature of legal evolution. This is a conceptual failure that undermines the analytical rigor required for a comprehensive understanding of the topic. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the historical context of regulations. This involves researching legislative history, significant court decisions, and the societal factors that prompted regulatory changes within Alabama. By understanding the why behind current rules, professionals can better interpret their application, anticipate future developments, and uphold their ethical and regulatory obligations with greater competence. Question 14. The investigation demonstrates that a financial advisor in Alabama, influenced by the philosophical concepts of Jacques Derrida and Roberto Ungur, is considering how to integrate these ideas into their client advisory practice. The advisor believes that a deconstructivist approach could reveal hidden assumptions in a client's financial goals, and that Ungur's ideas on social possibility could lead to more transformative financial planning. Considering the regulatory framework governing financial advisors in Alabama, which of the following approaches best aligns with professional and ethical obligations? Option A. The advisor should actively employ deconstructivist techniques to challenge the fundamental nature of a client's financial aspirations, aiming to uncover deeper, perhaps unarticulated, desires that may contradict their stated objectives. Option B. The advisor should focus on abstract philosophical discussions with clients about the nature of wealth and value, using Derrida and Ungur as primary frameworks to guide their understanding of financial decisions. Option C. The advisor should prioritize the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance, ensuring all recommendations are suitable and compliant with the Alabama Securities Act and federal regulations, while maintaining transparency about any potential influence of philosophical perspectives on their advisory process. Option D. The advisor should leverage Ungur's theories to propose radical restructuring of a client's financial portfolio and life goals, emphasizing the potential for social and personal transformation beyond conventional financial planning. The correct answer is C. The advisor should prioritize the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance, ensuring all recommendations are suitable and compliant with the Alabama Securities Act and federal regulations, while maintaining transparency about any potential influence of philosophical perspectives on their advisory process. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a financial advisor in Alabama must navigate the complex ethical landscape of client relationships, particularly when dealing with differing philosophical underpinnings of advisory practice. The challenge lies in reconciling the advisor's personal philosophical leanings, potentially influenced by figures like Jacques Derrida and Roberto Ungur, with the fiduciary duties and regulatory obligations mandated by Alabama law and federal securities regulations. Professional must prioritize the client's best interests above all else, ensuring transparency and avoiding any imposition of personal philosophical frameworks that could compromise objective advice. The best approach involves a rigorous adherence to the Alabama Securities Act and relevant SEC regulations, which mandate a fiduciary standard for investment advisors. This means acting with undivided loyalty to the client, placing their interests ahead of the advisor's own, and providing advice that is solely in the client's best interest. This approach requires the advisor to critically examine their own philosophical interpretations and ensure they do not lead to recommendations that are not objectively suitable for the client's financial goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon. The advisor must be able to articulate the rationale behind their recommendations based on established financial principles and regulatory requirements, not on abstract philosophical concepts that may not be understood or beneficial to the client. Transparency about any potential conflicts of interest, even those stemming from philosophical biases, is paramount. An approach that prioritizes the imposition of a deconstructivist philosophical lens, as might be inspired by Derrida, to question the very nature of financial planning and client goals would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to advice that is not grounded in practical financial realities or regulatory mandates, potentially confusing or misleading the client and failing to meet their actual financial needs. Such an approach could violate the duty of care and the obligation to provide suitable recommendations. Similarly, an approach that seeks to radically reconstruct the client's financial life based on unjurors' ideas of social transformation, without explicit client consent and a clear understanding of the client's objectives, would be problematic. While unjurors' work can inspire innovative thinking, applying it directly to client advice without a strong foundation in established financial planning principles and regulatory compliance could lead to unsuitable or overly risky strategies. This would fail to uphold the fiduciary duty and could expose the client to undue risk, violating the principles of prudence and suitability. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the advisor's fiduciary responsibilities under Alabama law. This includes a commitment to acting in the client's best interest, maintaining objectivity, providing full disclosure, and ensuring that all recommendations are suitable and aligned with the client's stated goals and risk profile. Advisors should continuously self-evaluate their own biases, whether philosophical or otherwise, and ensure they do not interfere with their professional obligations. When in doubt, seeking guidance from compliance departments or legal counsel is a prudent step. Question 15. Analysis of the application of property law principles in rural Alabama, considering the historical context of land ownership and access. How might a legal professional best reconcile the established doctrines of adverse possession and eminent domain with critiques from critical legal studies that highlight potential systemic biases and power imbalances inherent in these legal mechanisms? Option A. Advocate for the immediate abolition of adverse possession and eminent domain in Alabama, citing critical legal studies' arguments about their inherent unfairness. Option B. Acknowledge the potential for bias within established doctrines, apply them diligently according to Alabama precedent, and advocate for reforms that address identified inequities through legislative or judicial channels. Option C. Selectively apply critical legal studies arguments to challenge adverse possession or eminent domain claims only when it serves a client's immediate interests, regardless of broader legal principles. Option D. Dismiss critical legal studies critiques as irrelevant to the practical application of Alabama property law, focusing solely on precedent and statutory interpretation. The correct answer is B. Acknowledge the potential for bias within established doctrines, apply them diligently according to Alabama precedent, and advocate for reforms that address identified inequities through legislative or judicial channels. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the inherent tensions between established legal doctrines and the critiques offered by critical legal studies, CLS, scholars. The challenge lies in discerning whether to rigidly adhere to existing Alabama jurisprudence or to acknowledge and potentially integrate the insights of CLS that question the neutrality and fairness of those very doctrines. A careful judgment is required to balance legal precedent with a critical examination of power structures and social inequalities that CLS purports to reveal within the legal system. The best professional approach involves critically engaging with CLS critiques to understand their implications for Alabama law, without necessarily abandoning established legal principles. This means acknowledging that legal rules, while appearing neutral, may have historically embedded biases or disproportionately affect certain groups. However, it also means recognizing that the role of a legal professional in Alabama is to apply the law as it stands, while simultaneously being aware of its potential limitations and advocating for reform through appropriate legal and political channels. This approach respects the existing legal framework while embracing intellectual honesty and a commitment to justice. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss CLS critiques outright, arguing that Alabama law is inherently just and neutral simply because it is codified and applied by courts. This fails to acknowledge the historical context and potential for systemic bias that CLS scholars highlight. Such a stance risks perpetuating existing inequalities by ignoring their legal manifestations and can lead to a rigid and unthinking application of the law. Another incorrect approach would be to embrace CLS critiques to the extent that it leads to the wholesale rejection of established Alabama legal doctrines. While CLS encourages questioning, a professional must operate within the legal system. Abandoning established precedent without a clear legal basis or procedural mechanism would undermine the rule of law and create legal uncertainty. This approach prioritizes theoretical critique over practical legal application and professional responsibility. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to selectively apply CLS critiques only when they align with a desired outcome, while ignoring them when they challenge a preferred legal interpretation. This represents a form of intellectual dishonesty and a failure to engage with the critiques in a comprehensive and principled manner. It undermines the credibility of the legal professional and can lead to inconsistent and unfair legal outcomes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves, first, thoroughly understanding the specific Alabama legal doctrines in question. Second, researching and critically evaluating relevant CLS scholarship and its potential applicability to those doctrines. Third, assessing the practical implications of integrating CLS insights within the existing legal framework, considering both potential benefits and drawbacks. And fourth, making reasoned judgments that uphold professional obligations while remaining open to the possibility of legal reform informed by a critical understanding of the law's social impact. Question 16. Consider a scenario where a female entrepreneur in Alabama is seeking to enforce a contract against a male business partner who is attempting to use a technicality in the contract's wording to avoid his obligations. The entrepreneur believes her partner's actions are motivated by a desire to exploit her perceived lack of business acumen, a perception she feels is rooted in gender stereotypes. When preparing to argue the case in an Alabama court, how should the legal counsel best approach the interpretation and application of Alabama contract law to ensure a just outcome? Option A. Make broad assertions about gender inequality in business without specific legal arguments tied to the contract's interpretation or Alabama law. Option B. Argue that gender stereotypes are irrelevant to contract law and that the case should be decided purely on objective legal principles, ignoring any potential gender dynamics. Option C. Advocate for an interpretation of the contract that considers the potential for gender bias to have influenced the partner's actions and the resulting legal dispute, seeking remedies that address substantive equality. Option D. Focus solely on the literal wording of the contract and established Alabama contract law precedents, without delving into the potential motivations or gendered implications of the dispute. The correct answer is C. Advocate for an interpretation of the contract that considers the potential for gender bias to have influenced the partner's actions and the resulting legal dispute, seeking remedies that address substantive equality. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the complex intersection of legal interpretation, societal norms, and the specific ethical obligations of legal professionals in Alabama. The challenge lies in applying established legal principles to a situation where underlying assumptions about gender roles and power dynamics might be implicitly influencing the legal framework or its application. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the pursuit of justice is not inadvertently undermined by unconscious biases or a failure to recognize systemic inequalities. The best professional approach involves a critical examination of the legal arguments through the lens of feminist jurisprudence. This means actively considering how traditional legal doctrines might disadvantage women or perpetuate gender-based inequalities. It requires questioning the neutrality of legal language and concepts, and exploring how power imbalances might shape legal outcomes. In this context, the legal professional should advocate for interpretations and applications of Alabama law that acknowledge and address potential gendered impacts, ensuring that the law serves to promote substantive equality rather than merely formal equality. This aligns with the ethical duty to zealously represent a client while upholding the principles of justice and fairness, which, under a feminist jurisprudential framework, necessitates an awareness of gendered power dynamics. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a literal or traditional interpretation of Alabama statutes and case law without considering their potential gendered implications. This approach fails to engage with the critical insights of feminist jurisprudence, potentially perpetuating existing inequalities by assuming the neutrality of legal frameworks that may, in practice, reflect historical gender biases. Such a failure to critically examine the law's impact on different genders could lead to unjust outcomes and violate the spirit of equitable justice. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the relevance of feminist jurisprudence entirely, arguing that legal analysis should be strictly objective and devoid of social or gender considerations. This stance ignores the reality that legal systems are developed within and influenced by societal contexts, which often include deeply ingrained gender norms. By refusing to acknowledge these influences, a legal professional risks overlooking crucial aspects of a case that may disproportionately affect women, thereby failing to provide comprehensive and effective representation. A further incorrect approach would be to adopt a superficial understanding of feminist jurisprudence, perhaps by making broad generalizations about gender, without a nuanced analysis of how specific legal doctrines or factual circumstances in Alabama might create or exacerbate gender inequality. This can lead to misapplied arguments or an inability to effectively advocate for the client's specific situation within the existing legal framework. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to continuous learning and critical self-reflection. Legal professionals should actively seek to understand various jurisprudential theories, including feminist jurisprudence, and consider how these perspectives can inform their analysis of cases. When faced with situations that may involve gendered power dynamics or potential discrimination, a thorough review of relevant Alabama law should be coupled with an assessment of how those laws might be interpreted or applied in a way that promotes substantive equality. This involves questioning assumptions, considering alternative interpretations, and advocating for legal outcomes that are not only legally sound, but also ethically just and equitable for all parties, irrespective of gender. Question 17. During the evaluation of a case involving a novel interpretation of an Alabama statute, a legal professional discovers a prior Alabama Supreme Court decision that directly addresses a similar, though not identical, factual scenario. This prior ruling, if applied strictly, would likely lead to an unfavorable outcome for the client. What is the most appropriate course of action for the legal professional in Alabama? Option A. Decline representation of the client due to the existence of unfavorable precedent from the Alabama Supreme Court. Option B. Proceed with the case by ignoring the prior Alabama Supreme Court decision and arguing for a new interpretation of the statute, assuming the court will adopt this new view. Option C. Misrepresent the holding of the prior Alabama Supreme Court decision to the court to avoid its application to the current case. Option D. Conduct thorough research to identify any legal or factual distinctions that would allow the prior ruling to be distinguished, or develop a compelling argument for why the prior ruling should be overturned or modified by the Alabama Supreme Court, while acknowledging the principle of stare decisis. The correct answer is D. Conduct thorough research to identify any legal or factual distinctions that would allow the prior ruling to be distinguished, or develop a compelling argument for why the prior ruling should be overturned or modified by the Alabama Supreme Court, while acknowledging the principle of stare decisis. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a legal professional in Alabama to balance the fundamental principle of stare decisis with the potential for a prior ruling to be demonstrably unjust or outdated. Adhering strictly to precedent without critical evaluation can perpetuate errors, while disregarding it without proper justification undermines legal stability. Careful judgment is required to determine when and how to challenge existing interpretations of Alabama law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough analysis of the prior Alabama Supreme Court decision, identifying specific legal reasoning, factual findings that are questionable or no longer align with current societal understanding or statutory intent. This approach necessitates researching subsequent Alabama case law to see if the precedent has been implicitly or explicitly distinguished or limited. If such analysis reveals a strong basis for arguing the prior decision was wrongly decided or has become unworkable, then presenting a well-reasoned argument for overturning or modifying the precedent to the Alabama Supreme Court, while acknowledging the general importance of stare decisis, is the correct course of action. This respects the doctrine while allowing for legal evolution when necessary, aligning with the Alabama rules of professional conduct regarding diligent representation and the pursuit of justice. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply ignore the prior Alabama Supreme Court ruling and proceed with a legal strategy based on a different interpretation of the law. This fails to acknowledge the binding authority of precedent established by the highest court in Alabama, violating the core principle of stare decisis and demonstrating a lack of professional diligence and respect for the judicial system. Another incorrect approach is to refuse to represent the client because the existing precedent is unfavorable. Professionals have the right to decline representation, doing so solely because of an unfavorable ruling, without exploring all legitimate legal avenues to challenge or distinguish that ruling, falls short of the duty to zealously represent a client within the bounds of the law. It prioritizes personal comfort over professional obligation. A third incorrect approach is to misrepresent the holding of the prior Alabama Supreme Court decision to the court or the opposing party in an attempt to circumvent its application. This is a clear ethical violation, constituting dishonesty and a breach of the duty of candor toward the tribunal. It undermines the integrity of the legal process and the professional's own standing. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach situations involving unfavorable precedent by first understanding the doctrine of stare decisis and its importance in maintaining predictability and stability in Alabama law. They must then conduct exhaustive legal research to ascertain the precise scope and reasoning of the prior ruling. If the precedent appears flawed, outdated, or distinguishable, the professional should develop a strategic legal argument that respectfully challenges the precedent, citing relevant legal principles and any subsequent developments in Alabama jurisprudence. This process requires a commitment to ethical advocacy, diligent research, and a nuanced understanding of when and how to advocate for the modification or overturning of established law. Question 18. Research into the Alabama legislative process reveals a proposed bill that could significantly impact your client's business. To effectively advocate for your client's interests, which approach best aligns with Alabama's regulatory framework and ethical standards for influencing legislation? Option A. Provide legislators with misleading information about the bill's potential economic benefits to the state, emphasizing only the positive aspects while omitting potential negative consequences. Option B. Arrange for substantial, undisclosed campaign contributions to key legislators who sit on the relevant committees, hoping to gain their favorable consideration of the bill. Option C. Focus efforts exclusively on influencing the committee chair through informal social engagements, believing that personal rapport is the most effective means of persuasion. Option D. Engage in direct, transparent communication with Alabama legislators and their staff, providing factual information and arguments supporting your client's position, while adhering to all disclosure requirements for lobbying activities. The correct answer is D. Engage in direct, transparent communication with Alabama legislators and their staff, providing factual information and arguments supporting your client's position, while adhering to all disclosure requirements for lobbying activities. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the intricate legislative process in Alabama while upholding ethical obligations to represent a client's interests effectively and transparently. The core challenge lies in understanding the nuances of bill introduction, committee review, and floor debate, and how to strategically influence these stages without engaging in unethical practices. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate advocacy and undue influence. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of the Alabama legislative process and engaging in direct, transparent communication with elected officials and their staff regarding the client's position on the proposed legislation. This approach prioritizes factual accuracy, ethical lobbying, and adherence to all Alabama ethics laws and regulations governing interactions with legislators. It acknowledges that influencing legislation is a legitimate part of the democratic process when conducted openly and honestly. An incorrect approach would be to attempt to influence legislators through undisclosed financial contributions or by leveraging personal relationships without disclosing the client's direct interest in the legislation. This fails to adhere to Alabama's ethics laws, which mandate transparency in lobbying activities and prohibit quid pro quo arrangements. Such actions can lead to accusations of bribery or corruption, undermining both the individual's professional standing and the integrity of the legislative process. Another incorrect approach involves misrepresenting the scope or impact of the proposed legislation to legislators. This is ethically unsound and can lead to unintended consequences if the bill is passed based on false pretenses. It violates the professional duty of candor and honesty owed to public officials and can result in legal repercussions for both the lobbyist and the client. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on influencing committee members without considering the broader legislative context, including potential amendments during floor debate or the governor's role in signing or vetoing the bill. This demonstrates a lack of comprehensive understanding of the legislative process and can lead to wasted effort and an ineffective advocacy strategy. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant jurisdiction's laws and regulations governing legislative advocacy. This includes researching Alabama's statutes on lobbying, campaign finance, and ethics. The next step is to identify the specific stages of the legislative process relevant to the client's objectives and to develop a strategy that aligns with ethical principles and legal requirements. This strategy should prioritize clear, factual communication, transparency, and building relationships based on trust and integrity. Regular review of the evolving legislative landscape and adapting the strategy accordingly is also crucial. Question 19. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client in Alabama seeks advice on a course of action that, while appearing morally just from a personal perspective rooted in inherent fairness, directly contradicts a specific statute enacted by the Alabama legislature. Considering the principles of legal jurisprudence relevant to Alabama, which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Proceed with the client's requested action, arguing that a higher moral law supersedes the enacted statute and that personal conscience dictates the correct path. Option B. Seek to circumvent the Alabama statute by creatively interpreting its provisions based on abstract notions of natural justice, without a clear legal basis within Alabama's established jurisprudence. Option C. Encourage the client to disregard the Alabama statute and proceed with their desired action, asserting that their personal sense of justice is the ultimate arbiter. Option D. Advise the client that the requested action cannot be legally undertaken due to the conflict with Alabama statutes, and explain the legal ramifications of proceeding against the law. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that the requested action cannot be legally undertaken due to the conflict with Alabama statutes, and explain the legal ramifications of proceeding against the law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to reconcile a perceived moral imperative with the established legal framework of Alabama. The conflict arises when a client's request, while potentially viewed as ethically justifiable from a natural law perspective, i.e., a higher moral order, directly contravenes specific Alabama statutes. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the supremacy of enacted law and the professional obligations of those operating within the legal system. Careful judgment is required to avoid personal moral beliefs from overriding legal duties. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves advising the client that their request, while perhaps stemming from a personal sense of justice or fairness, cannot be legally fulfilled under Alabama law. This approach is correct because it upholds the principle of legal positivism, which asserts that law is a social construct and that valid laws are those enacted by a legitimate authority, regardless of their perceived moral content. Alabama's statutory framework, as enacted by its legislature, is the binding legal authority. Professionals in Alabama are ethically and legally bound to advise clients within the confines of these enacted laws. To do otherwise would be to engage in unprofessional conduct and potentially facilitate illegal activity. Incorrect approaches analysis. advising the client that the request can proceed based on a personal interpretation of natural justice, without regard for Alabama statutes, is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to acknowledge the binding nature of enacted law and prioritizes a subjective moral framework over objective legal requirements, risks misleading the client and exposing them to legal repercussions. Furthermore, suggesting that the client should disregard Alabama law and act according to their own moral compass is a dereliction of professional duty and an abdication of responsibility. It undermines the rule of law and the integrity of the legal profession. Finally, attempting to find a loophole in the law based solely on a natural law argument, without a sound legal basis within Alabama's statutory or case law, is speculative and unprofessional. It risks misrepresenting the law and providing inadequate counsel. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the enacted laws of the state. When faced with a client's request that appears to conflict with established statutes, the first step is to thoroughly research and understand the relevant Alabama laws. If the request is indeed contrary to these laws, the professional's duty is to clearly and unequivocally inform the client of the legal limitations. The professional should then explore all legally permissible avenues to achieve the client's underlying objectives, if possible, within the bounds of Alabama law. If no legal recourse exists, the professional must advise the client of this reality, explaining the consequences of proceeding against the law. Personal moral beliefs, while important, must not supersede the professional obligation to uphold and advise within the established legal framework. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows a client in Alabama seeking to liquidate a significant parcel of inherited land. The client believes the land is worth $500,000 based on a recent appraisal. However, historical records suggest the land was originally granted to the client's ancestors under a specific 19th century Alabama land grant that may have included certain perpetual agricultural use covenants. If these covenants are still legally binding and enforceable under current Alabama law, the land's market value could be significantly reduced, potentially by 20% due to restrictions on development. The client needs to understand the potential financial impact of these historical covenants before proceeding with the sale. Calculate the potential minimum value of the land if the historical covenants are found to be enforceable, and then determine the maximum potential loss in value from the initial appraisal. Option A. The minimum value of the land would be $400,000, resulting in a maximum potential loss of $100,000. Option B. The minimum value of the land would be $450,000, resulting in a maximum potential loss of $50,000. Option C. The minimum value of the land would be $375,000, resulting in a maximum potential loss of $125,000. Option D. The minimum value of the land would be $425,000, resulting in a maximum potential loss of $75,000. The correct answer is A. The minimum value of the land would be $400,000, resulting in a maximum potential loss of $100,000. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate financial desires and the long-term, prudent management of their estate, especially when historical context is crucial for informed decision-making. The need for careful judgment arises from the fiduciary duty owed to the client and the potential for significant financial repercussions if decisions are made without a thorough understanding of the underlying legal and historical framework governing their assets in Alabama. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive approach that prioritizes understanding the historical context of the client's assets and their implications under Alabama law. This includes researching the origin of the assets, any specific covenants or restrictions attached to them, and how Alabama's historical property laws, such as those related to land grants or inheritance, might impact their current valuation and disposition. For instance, understanding the historical significance of a particular piece of land in Alabama, perhaps tied to early statehood or specific agricultural practices, could reveal easements, mineral rights, or other encumbrances not immediately apparent from a modern appraisal. This approach ensures that any financial advice or action taken is grounded in a complete legal and historical understanding, aligning with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest and adhering to the principles of sound estate management as understood within Alabama's jurisprudence. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on current market valuations without investigating the historical provenance of the assets. This fails to account for potential historical legal claims or restrictions that could significantly alter the asset's true value or marketability within Alabama. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's immediate liquidation request without due diligence into the historical implications, potentially leading to a sale that undervalues the asset or incurs unforeseen liabilities under Alabama law. Furthermore, adopting a purely transactional mindset, focusing only on the immediate financial gain, neglects the broader fiduciary responsibilities and the potential for long-term detriment to the client's estate, especially when historical factors in Alabama could dictate a more nuanced strategy. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough client needs assessment, followed by comprehensive due diligence into the nature and history of all assets. This involves consulting relevant historical legal documents, understanding Alabama-specific property laws and their evolution, and then integrating this historical understanding with current financial analysis to provide advice that is both legally sound and financially prudent for the client's estate in Alabama.